This presentation is a production of the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. Our technologically advanced existence makes our days easier, brings enjoyment to our lives, and seems to infuse prosperity wherever it goes. But this miraculous way of life also creates a deadly tide of toxic materials that threatens our health and the very way of life we cherish. We were looking into the eyes of a national catastrophe.
According to one authority, the potential dangers toxic waste poses are second only to the threat of nuclear war.
Basically a situation where you had indiscriminate disposal of hazardous waste.
The trucks with the hazardous waste would back up, the truck drivers would just open the valve, and the waste went out right into the landfill.
Businesses would dispose of it on site. A common practice would be to have a pit inside the shop somewhere dug in there, and you would dump your waste in that.
It wasn't uncommon for someone to have a chemical that they didn't want anymore, and they took it out to the back 40 and they dumped it on the ground.
Solvent, TCE, whatever, out of sight, out of mind.
And we had drums of hazardous waste shooting up in the air like rockets.
In the summertime, ponds would heat up and start to bubble and release gases, and homes were immediately adjacent to the ponds.
The situation became very explosive because of the gases migrating into their homes.
When I was a prosecutor, I tried some of the most horrific crimes that one could imagine. I've never seen anything like the devastation that's wreaked by environmental violation.
In 1974 in California, a team was assembled to stop the toxic ticking bomb.
The hazardous waste program actually started in the vector control program, which was in the Department of Health Services. The vector control people would go out and they would inspect landfills, and of course they're looking for rats, mosquitoes, any kind of animals that can carry disease.
How it grew out of the vector control section was that one of the major concerns at that time was people were disposing of toxic industrial waste in landfills.
The man in charge of the vector control program at that time was a man named Richard Peters, and he was a very forward-thinking individual. So he established this little tiny group within the vector control program to look at industrial waste and come up with some other sort of remedies to the disposal issue. At some point, he also hired Harvey Collins.
He was the first state employee charged with hazardous waste program startup in California. Then there were some people who were referred to us from EPA, I believe, but Harvey was the first one.
And so there was a group of people that in 1970-71 were starting to draft the Hazardous Waste Control Act.
There was Dr. David Storm and Paul Williams and Dr. Harvey Collins.
And at the time, they were calling it the Industrial Waste Control Act. But Harvey told us that nobody in the legislature would pay attention to this because industrial waste was much too boring of a topic. And so they renamed it hazardous waste at like 2 o'clock in the morning. And they introduced the bill and it passed. And so that was the foundation of California's Hazardous Waste Control Program, and it was the first hazardous waste control program in the country.
But with only a few people in its staff and a minuscule budget, it could barely begin to understand the challenge it faced, let alone confront it.
Yeah, I started in the Food and Drug Lab, then the Department of Health, at 2151 Berkeley Way, the old lab complex. And I guess I saw some of my future when a guy came in, turned out to be Bob Stevens, with an ugly jar of stuff. I was doing some analysis with a gas chromatograph at GC, and Bob came in, I hadn't seen him before, took a sample of headspace from this, shot it into a GC, and the pen on the chromatogram just pegged. And he went wow, and I went wow. And that would sort of symbolize, I think, a lot of my experience in DTSC, that we weren't dealing with parts per million of something, we were dealing with really gross contamination.
When I first started with the department, it was the Hazardous Materials Management section in Health Services. Statewide, there were maybe 50 people at that time, and that included down in the Berkeley office. CHARLENE Williams was one of the key people down there.
I started with the department in September of 1979. I was a field inspector for a couple of years. Then I became a permit writer, and in 1983 I was promoted to supervisor.
I was brought over to develop sampling and analytical methods, and we were starting from scratch.
And at first we called the waste streams only by name, and then came toxicity characteristics and aquatic toxicity, and all that to be used in a more generic way.
Develop our own samplers, including the composite liquid waste sampler, the Kaliwasa.
I started working on a research project to develop sampling and analytical methods for hazardous waste, and to develop a method for determining the compatibility of waste.
So we did produce for EPA a sampling manual, samplers and sampling procedures, which they then incorporated in something called SW846, which became a compendium of test methods and sampling methods.
When I started, my training consisted of somebody giving me a copy of the law and the regulations, and they put me in a room for 2 weeks and they said, read these documents.
Everyone was learning as we went. If you answered the phone and took a question about much of anything, you became the expert in that area.
Didn't really have much in the way of personal protective equipment.
The personal protective equipment that we had when I started consisted of rubber boots, little gloves that would be used in surgery, and we went to Sears and bought cloth coveralls.
Based on my personal experiences, I sometimes marvel at the fact that I and others are even here today, given some of the things that we did in the early days.
The first thing I did coming to the department was help to respond to public comments and questions regarding a fire that happened at a site where a fellow had collected thousands of drums.
Stacked up in a way that it posed an imminent hazard, which became a real hazard when the site was torched.
And we had drums of hazardous waste shooting up in the air like rockets.
Drums had exploded, hurled across the flood control channel, impaling themselves on the fence on the other side.
The water that was used to put out the fire went down into the LA flood control channel and caused a major fish kill.
I started as regional administrator. There were, at that time, 10 people in the Southern California area, and we had the entire 8 Southern California counties to do permits, surveillance, and enforcement in.
There were 10 people in the Berkeley office, and there were 50 people in this program statewide. And there were 4 inspectors, and we did everything. We tried to write permits, we did inspections, we tried to do site cleanups. And needless to say, we were very busy, and things were very confusing because you never knew what you were going to do from one day to another.
The toxics program was just growing and getting started, and there was a huge demand on the agency to accomplish miracles, get rid of all of the illegal hazardous waste activities that had been going on for years, get all these permits out for the facilities, and get sites cleaned up.